So if you go back to December 1683, the most powerful military commander in the Ottoman Empire, this guy Grand Vizier, Mirza Kara Mustafa Pasha, is sitting in a palace in Belgrade.
Right, he's just retreated there.
Exactly. And a messenger arrives from Constantinople. And this messenger is carrying a small velvet bag and a silken cord.
Yeah, which in the political language of the Ottoman court, that cord has a very specific, undeniable meaning.
It's an execution order, right?
It is. It means execution by strangulation. That was a method strictly reserved for high-ranking nobility, carefully designed so their blood would never actually touch the earth.
Wow. So today, in this deep dive, we are dissecting the fatal, really world-altering miscalculations that ultimately put that cord around his neck. We are looking at the 1683 siege of Vienna.
But we're taking a very different approach to this history today. We are going to strip away that traditional, the romanticized Western-centric mythology.
Right, the whole narrative of a heroic Europe standing alone against the dark.
Exactly. Instead, we're examining this pivotal event entirely through the eyes of the Ottoman Empire. We want to stand with the Ottoman High Command and look westward at Vienna, a city they viewed as the ultimate lock on the door of Europe, basically.
And we really want you, listening right now, to experience this campaign from the perspective of Kara Mustafa himself. The sources for this deep dive are just incredibly extensive.
They really are. We're drawing from Ottoman administrative records, the biographical data of Kara Mustafa, and detailed casualty and logistical ledgers that were actually recovered from the battlefield.
Yeah, plus some really comprehensive narrative reconstructions of the campaign. And, my role today is to represent you, the listener. I'll be looking at this from a modern perspective, asking the logistical questions and trying to figure out exactly what the Ottomans fundamentally misunderstood about Vienna and its defenders.
And I'll be laying out the documentary facts, really trying to contextualize that 17th century Ottoman mindset and narrating the campaign as it was lived on the ground. So I want to invite you to step into the boots of the Ottoman High Command today. Try to look at this not as a doomed historical footnote where you already know the ending.
Right. Try to see it as a living, breathing military operation.
Yes, an operation of unprecedented scale that right up until the final hours was entirely expected to succeed and permanently alter the geopolitical map.
So to understand the siege, I feel like we have to start by profiling the architect. We really need to understand the psychology of Kara Mustafa Pasha.
Absolutely.
Because if I'm looking at a man who is willing to march an army across a continent just to crack open a fortified imperial capital, I want to know the underlying drive. Who was he? And why was he so utterly obsessed with this specific city?
Well, Kara Mustafa was born around 1634, 1635 in a village near Mersifon, which is in Anatolia. He was of Turkish origin, the son of a sipahi, a cavalryman.
Okay, so a military background.
Yeah, but the trajectory of his life fundamentally changes when he is brought into the household of the incredibly powerful Köprülü family.
And who were they exactly?
They were this elite family, originally of Albanian descent, that produced a whole dynasty of Grand Viziers. They essentially operated as the shadow rulers of the Ottoman Empire for decades.
Wait, shadow rulers? So they were pulling the strings behind the Sultan?
Basically, yes. They brought a period of extreme stability and a really puritanical military revival after what had been a pretty long era of imperial stagnation.
Got it. So he gets adopted into this political machine.
Right. He was educated by Köprülü Mehmed Pasha, and he serves in the inner administration. He starts as a letter carrier, then an armorer, and eventually he becomes the master of the horse for Sultan Mehmed V himself.
That's quite a climb.
Oh, it gets better. He actually marries into the Köprülü family, cementing his status. And by 1676, he had risen to become Grand Vizier.
Wow. So he's the second most powerful man in the empire.
Exactly. Answering only to the Sultan.
But rising through a political machine like that, it suggests a man who is hyper-competent, sure, but also someone who has survived a deeply ruthless environment.
Oh, without a doubt. The sources describe him as intensely ambitious, highly authoritarian, and reportedly harboring this really profound disdain for his European adversaries.
But his military record leading up to Vienna, it wasn't exactly spotless, right? The politics of Constantinople were sort of catching up with him.
Yeah, that political viper's nest in the capital was a matter of life and death. Between 1678 and 1681, Kara Mustafa tried to suppress a Cossack rebellion in Ukraine.
And how'd that go?
Well, his initial successes were entirely reversed by Russian military intervention. He was forced into a really humiliating retreat and had to sign the Treaty of Bakhchisarai in 1681.
Ah, okay, so he takes a major public loss.
Right. And that failure severely damaged his standing at court. You have the chief black eunuch, rival viziers, even the sultan's mother, the Valid Sultan. They were constantly whispering into Mehmed V's ear.
Saying what? That he was losing his touch.
Exactly, suggesting that he was overstepping, that he was weak. So he was a man backed into a political corner. He desperately needed a victory on a massive, unfathomable scale just to make himself politically untouchable again.
He needed something like the fall of Constantinople in 1453 to shut his enemies up.
Precisely, to silence them permanently.
Okay, so the choice of Vienna as the target, then, it wasn't just strategic, it was deeply psychological. I mean, he didn't choose to push further into Russia to avenge his defeat or, launch a naval campaign. He chose Vienna because of the historical ghost hovering over the empire.
Yeah, he was directly competing with the legacy of Suleiman the Magnificent.
Who is basically the gold standard of Ottoman military glory, right?
Absolutely. But in 1529, Suleiman had marched on Vienna and failed to take it. He was forced to turn back by early winters and broken supply lines.
Right, so for 150 years, that specific failure had just haunted the empire.
It really did. Vienna was known as the Apple of Gold. To the Ottomans, it wasn't just a city, it was the gateway to the wealth of the entire European continent.
Because if you control Vienna, you control the Danube River.
Right, which is the arterial highway right into Central Europe. So Kara Mustafa genuinely believed he was the man destined by God to erase Suleiman's historic blemish.
But a grand vision like that requires a grand pretext, right? You can't just march an army into Europe for no reason.
True, but he was handed one by the internal politics of the Holy Roman Empire itself.
Right, the Habsburg Emperor, Leopold I, was enforcing these really strict counter-Reformation policies, basically actively repressing Protestants in Hungary.
Exactly, and this sparks a rebellion by the Hungarian Protestants, the Kuduk, who are led by a nobleman named Imre Thököly.
And Thököly essentially opens the door and invites the Ottoman Empire in, doesn't he?
He does. Thököly formally requests Ottoman military intervention against his Habsburg overlords. And the Ottomans had already recognized him as the king of Upper Hungary, so they were treating him as a vassal.
Which gives Kara Mustafa the perfect geopolitical opening.
Right. He persuades Sultan Mehmed IV to authorize a massive military campaign, framing it both as a fulfillment of treaty obligations to an ally and as a holy jihad against the Habsburgs.
And the logistics of what happens next are just staggering to think about.
Yeah.
Mobilizing an army in 1682 wasn't just issuing orders. It required creating a moving city.
It really did. When the army departs for Midurn in the spring of 1683, we are looking at numbers that kind of break modern comprehension of 17th century infrastructure.
Yeah, estimates put the fighting force alone between 90,000 and 170,000 men.
And we know this because captured documents detailing the order of battle were actually found later in Kara Mustafa's tent. They indicated a starting strength of roughly 170,000 men.
That is just a massive coalition.
It was. It included the elite Janissary infantry, soldiers who were conscripted as children, converted to Islam, and trained their entire lives for war.
Right, the absolute best of the best.
Yeah, and it included the Sepahdi heavy cavalry. Plus, they had 40,000 Crimean Tatar cavalry acting as outriders and raiders, along with vassal forces from Wallachia, Moldavia, and Transylvania.
To feed an army of that size, it requires a logistical miracle.
Oh, completely. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of pack animals, camels, mules, horses, requiring thousands of tons of grain and fodder every single day. And they're dragging artillery pieces through the mud of the Balkans.
And Sultan Mehmed V actually accompanied this massive column, right?
Yeah.
He's part of the way.
He did. He went as far as Belgrade, which lent it the ultimate imperial sanction, but then he returned to the capital.
Okay, wait, this is where I get hung up. If the Sultan only goes as far as Belgrade, and the official authorization is just to capture some border forts, we run into a massive chain of command issue here.
Oh, yes, we do.
Launching a siege against the imperial capital of the Holy Roman Empire without the Sultan's explicit understanding, that seems like a suicidal political gamble.
And that audacity is the defining trait of this entire campaign. The Sultan had authorized him to operate as far as the border castles of Győr and Komárom up in northwestern Hungary.
So that was the official plan presented in the war councils.
Right. But Kara Mustafa initiated the direct thrust toward Vienna entirely on his own authority. He bypassed those heavily fortified border forts, just leaving them in his rear.
Which is incredibly dangerous militarily.
Extremely. But he operated on this brutal binary logic. If he succeeded, the insubordination would be instantly forgiven.
Right. He'd return as the conqueror of the Apple of Gold.
Exactly. The greatest Grand Vizier in history. But if he failed, it was naked treason. He was gambling his life and the vast military resources of the empire on a single, unauthorized roll of the dice.
Wow. So on July 14, 1683, that roll of the dice brings him to the gates of Vienna, and he arrives to find a city in absolute panic.
Absolute panic.
Oh.
Emperor Leopold had already fled to Passau a week earlier, taking his court and about 60,000 citizens with him.
Just leaving the city behind.
Yeah. The defense of the city is left to Count Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg, who commands a garrison of just 15,000 professional soldiers and maybe 8,700 armed civilian volunteers.
So less than 25,000 men facing down over 100,000.
Right. And Kara Mustafa follows protocol and sends the traditional demand for surrender.
Because Islamic rules of war required that formal offer before a siege, right?
Yes. If the city surrendered without a fight, the lives and property of the inhabitants would be spared, and they would simply pay a poll tax. So he sends the envoys.
But Starhemberg refuses. And what's interesting is that this refusal isn't just stubbornness, it's calculated survival.
How so?
Well, from what the sources show, he had just received intelligence about what happened to the nearby town of Perchtoldsdorf.
Ah, right.
The citizens there had surrendered. They handed over their keys, relying on that exact guarantee of safety, and the Ottoman vanguard slaughtered them anyway.
Yeah, the Tatar raiders were notoriously difficult to control.
So surrender was no longer viewed as a safe harbor by the Viennese. It was seen as a death sentence. By refusing, Starhemberg backs his garrison into a corner where fighting to the last man is basically the only rational option.
That's a great point. So Starhemberg firmly refuses the demand, and the siege officially begins. And this requires us to look closely at the mechanical realities of the battlefield itself.
Right, because Vienna wasn't just a simple medieval castle.
No, its fortifications were designed by a brilliant engineer named Georg Rimpler. Vienna was surrounded by a trace Italian, a star fort configuration.
And for those who don't know, how is that different from a standard wall?
Well, flat medieval walls can be easily shattered by direct cannon fire, but a star fort features angled, protruding bastions. These angles are designed to deflect artillery fire and create overlapping fields of fire.
So if you assault one wall, you're getting shot at from the sides by the adjacent bastions.
Exactly. You are constantly in a crossfire.
Furthermore, the Viennese had ruthlessly prepared their ground, right? They demolished all their own suburbs outside the walls.
Yeah, they leveled homes, trees, fences, everything to create what is known as a glacis.
Which is basically a vast, sloping, completely cleared killing field.
Yep. Any Ottoman infantry unit attempting to round the walls would have to sprint across hundreds of yards of open ground, just completely exposed to massed musket and cannon fire.
And here's where Kara Mustafa's speed costs him. The Ottomans were at a severe technological disadvantage when it came to long-range bombardment.
Because he had planned this rapid thrust to Vienna on his own initiative, prioritizing speed, he left the massive, heavy siege cannons, the bombards that could actually pulverize stone walls back in the Balkans.
They were just too slow to drag through the mud.
Right. So the Ottoman army arrived with about 130 field guns and 19 medium-caliber cannons, which are highly effective against infantry, but utterly useless against packed earth and stone walls that are 20 feet thick.
Meanwhile, the Viennese defenders had roughly 370 cannons mounted on the walls.
Exactly. It was a massive artillery mismatch.
So if you lack the artillery to bring the walls down from afar, and rushing across the glacis guarantees your infantry will be annihilated, you have to find another way in.
You have to go under the glacis.
Which shifts the entire nature of this siege from a surface battle to just an absolute underground nightmare.
Kara Mustafa relied entirely on his La Mancha, his corps of 5,000 expert Ottoman sappers and miners.
And what was their strategy?
They dug intricate networks of zigzagging trenches on the surface to approach the glacis safely, and from those trenches, they would sink shafts deep into the earth. The goal was to dig silent, subterranean caverns directly beneath the city's massive bastions.
And then pack those caverns with thousands of pounds of black powder.
Exactly. Blow the fortifications apart from below.
But the Austrians obviously figured this out. And the mechanics of the countermining turned this into this terrifying game of three-dimensional chess played in total darkness.
They didn't just wait for the ground to explode. Austrian engineers began digging their own tunnels out from the city to intercept the Ottoman shafts.
The psychological terror of that underground war is difficult to even overstate. I read that Austrian miners would place drums of water on the floor of their tunnels and just stare at the surface for ripples.
Or press their ears to the dirt, just listening for the muffled sound of Ottoman pickaxes.
Desperately trying to locate the enemy shafts.
And when the two sides intersected in the pitch black, it just devolved into brutal, claustrophobic combat.
Men fighting with knives, pistols, and pickaxes in tunnels 3 feet wide.
Where the air is thick with dust and a single spark from a flintlock could ignite the powder reserves and just collapse the earth on top of everyone.
It's horrifying. But while this subterranean horror is unfolding, the surface remains an absolute meat grinder too.
Oh yeah, the Janissaries were ordered to launch 18 major surface assaults over 60 days just to keep the pressure on the defenders.
And this is happening in the extreme heat of July and August. Inside the walls, the physical toll is devastating. Disease breaks out.
Dysentery swept through the garrison.
And dysentery doesn't just kill, it completely destroys a soldier's stamina. It renders them incapable of lifting a weapon or digging a trench.
Fatigue became so profound that Starhemberg issued an order that any soldier found asleep on watch was to be summarily shot.
Just to force them to stay awake.
Yes, yet somehow the discipline held.
But I want to push back on this because the math is crazy. How does a force of under 25,000 hold off well over 100,000 for 2 months? Why didn't Kara Mustafa just overwhelm them with a massive, coordinated human wave assault?
He possessed a force so massive he could have done exactly that. He could have assaulted every side of the city simultaneously, absorbed the horrific casualties, and just drowned the defenders in bodies.
Why didn't he?
The reason reveals the fatal flaw in his character: boundless greed.
Really? How so?
Under the accepted rules of 17th century warfare, if a city was taken by an all-out violent assault, it triggered the traditional right of plunder. The soldiers would be allowed to sack the city for 3 days, stripping it of every ounce of gold, silver, and valuable goods, keeping the loot for themselves.
So if that happens, nothing is left for the Grand Vizier's personal treasury.
Exactly. Kara Mustafa wanted to force a formal capitulation so he could claim the legendary wealth of Vienna intact. His desire to keep the wealth for himself prevented him from authorizing the one tactic that might have actually overwhelmed the city early on.
That is incredible. His own greed bought the city 60 days of precious life.
It really did. But by early September, that borrowed time was running out. The underground war had finally yielded results for the Ottomans.
Right. They captured the Berg Revelin.
Yeah, which was a major triangular outer defensive bastion. The inner walls were severely compromised. The Ottoman sappers had successfully detonated mines that created gaps 12 meters wide in the main defenses.
They were practically inside.
The final massive subterranean detonation, the one designed to open a decisive breach that not even Starhemberg's discipline could plug, was supposed to be only days, maybe hours away.
The Viennese were literally fortifying the streets, preparing for house-to-house fighting.
They knew the end was coming.
But the timing of what happens next is almost cinematic. Just as the city is on the verge of absolute collapse, it's September 11th, 1683, and a massive relief army appears on the heights of the Kahlenberg.
Which is a steep, heavily wooded mountain ridge overlooking Vienna.
Right. And who makes up this relief army?
This was a monumental coalition effort, roughly 70,000 men strong. It consisted of imperial forces, Saxons, Bavarians, and Franconians, under the command of Charles of Lorraine.
And a massive Polish contingent as well, right?
Yes, personally led by King John III Sobieski. They had marched rapidly through really difficult terrain to reach the city before it fell.
So put yourself in Kara Mustafa's headquarters that night. He steps out of his tent and looks up at the Kahlenberg Ridge. The entire mountain is illuminated.
He sees hundreds of bonfires lit by the Christian coalition.
Which was a deliberate psychological tactic, right? To signal their arrival to the desperate garrison below.
Exactly. And for a man who had spent 2 months treating this siege as an inevitable mathematical equation, this must have been the first moment of genuine creeping dread.
Because he's suddenly looking at a king who has left his own capital of Krakow undefended, just to sit on a hill above his enemies.
Right. A monarch doesn't do that unless he is absolutely committed to a decisive, to-the-death engagement.
So the sudden appearance of 70,000 fresh troops triggers an emergency council of war in the Ottoman camp. And from what I understand, the argument that followed was really the turning point of the entire campaign.
It was. Kara Mustafa's senior general, Ibrahim Pasha, who is a very seasoned, pragmatic commander, looked at the tactical reality and argued passionately for a strategic withdrawal.
Which makes sense. His logic was basically unassailable.
Completely. Fighting a two-front war is tactical suicide. You cannot face a fresh, motivated relief army charging down a mountain while simultaneously trying to suppress a desperate, entrenched garrison sallying out from the city behind you.
So Ibrahim Pasha urges him to pull back.
Yes, preserve the massive army, move to the open plains where Ottoman cavalry actually had the tactical advantage, and fight on their own terms.
It sounds like a gambler who is down to his last chips and refuses to walk away from the table. Ibrahim Pasha is offering a lifeline. It is the only militarily sound decision.
But Kara Mustafa overrules him.
Was it pure arrogance, or did he know that returning without Vienna meant his execution anyway?
It was a mix, but largely it was a fatal failure of imagination, driven by the sunk cost fallacy. He had spent 2 months and thousands of lives believing he was on the precipice of historical glory.
He thought the walls would crumble the very next morning.
He was convinced of it. He believed the city would capitulate, and he could then pivot to face the relief force from a position of impregnable strength, utilizing the captured cannons of Vienna against Sobieski.
He just simply could not process a reality where he walked away empty-handed.
Right. So he orders the elite Janissaries to remain in the siege trenches to keep the pressure on the crumbling walls, while he orders the rest of his exhausted army to turn and face the relief force.
He divides his forces at the exact moment he needs overwhelming concentration.
Exactly. He doubled down on a losing hand.
So early the next morning, September 12, the battle actually begins. The Ottomans launch a preemptive attack around 4:00 a.m., aimed at disrupting the deployment of the Holy League troops as they descend the mountain.
The fighting begins on the uneven, heavily cultivated slopes of the Kahlenberg, specifically around these fortified villages of Neusdorf and Heiligenstadt.
And the terrain here is so crucial, isn't it?
Oh, the terrain dictated the entire flow of the early battle. The imperial forces under Charles of Lorraine were slowly pushing the Ottomans back through terraced vineyards, deep ditches, and stone walls.
And if you're fielding cavalry, that is a nightmare.
A total nightmare. A cavalry charge relies entirely on flat ground to maintain a solid, unbroken wall of momentum.
Right. Terraced vineyards cause horses to trip, break formation, and funnel into narrow paths.
So the terrain completely neutralized the Ottoman Sipahi cavalry. They couldn't charge. They were reduced to a chaotic, ineffective traffic jam,
leaving the Ottoman infantry to bear the brunt of a grueling, day-long slog.
For 14 hours, the Imperial and German infantry just grind the Ottoman lines down. The Ottoman forces are being physically compressed into an ever-shrinking pocket between the advancing relief army and the city walls.
Meanwhile, on the right flank, the Polish infantry has spent the entire day methodically clearing villages and securing a staging ground, because what they are preparing for is one of the most devastating kinetic events in the history of warfare.
Yeah, by 6:00 p.m., the stage is set.
Tell me about this charge, because the scale is just hard to picture.
By late afternoon, the Ottoman lines were exhausted, demoralized, and dangerously thin. King John III Sobieski observed the battlefield from a high vantage point and decided the moment had come to break the Ottoman army completely.
So he commits the heavy cavalry.
18,000 horsemen poured down the slopes.
18,000?
Yes. And at the tip of the spear were 3,000 legendary Polish winged hussars.
And these guys were terrifying, right?
Absolutely. They were heavily armored shock cavalry carrying massive lances called kopias, and they wore these hollow wooden frames on their backs adorned with eagle or ostrich feathers.
Feathers? Why?
Because as they accelerated, the wind rushing through these feathers created a terrifying, unearthly hum. It was a deliberate weapon of acoustic terror designed to spook enemy horses and break the nerve of the infantry.
Wow. And this assault is widely considered the largest unified cavalry charge in the history of warfare.
It is.
I mean, the physics of 18,000 heavy horses accelerating down a slope into a tightly packed enemy formation. It's apocalyptic. The ground itself would have been shaking.
But we have to view this impact through the lens of Ottoman attrition, too.
Right, because the army waiting at the bottom of the hill isn't the pristine 170,000 strong juggernaut that left Edirne.
Far from it. They were a hollowed-out shell. Captured casualty lists tell a really grim story. Before Sobieski's cavalry even began their descent, the Ottomans had already suffered horrifying losses.
How bad was it?
Nearly 48,000 men had died over the previous 60 days, slaughtered in the surface assaults, buried alive in tunneling accidents, or entirely consumed by the dysentery outbreak.
Plus the desertions.
Yeah, nearly 25% of the vassal troops had simply walked away into the night.
So the Polish charge hits an army that is already bleeding to death and psychologically shattered.
The result was instantaneous collapse. The tired, dispirited Ottoman lines offered almost no resistance. The heavy cavalry shattered the center and rode directly into the Ottoman camps, heading straight for Kara Mustafa's headquarters.
And the garrison inside Vienna wasn't just watching this happen either.
No. Observing the sudden chaos, they sallied out from the city gates, attacking the Janissaries trapped in the trenches from the rear.
So the Ottoman forces were trapped in a vice.
In less than 3 hours after the cavalry charge began, the battle was definitively over. The mighty siege apparatus simply disintegrated.
I wonder how an army that vast evaporates in mere hours. Was the physical impact of the horses really enough to break them, or were they just psychologically dead after 60 days in the trenches?
The charge was merely the hammer blow shattering an already fragile, exhausted structure. They were entirely broken.
So the aftermath of the battle is just a study in absolute panic. The Ottoman army breaks and runs, abandoning everything in their sheer terror to escape the slaughter.
And the logistical miracle that had brought them there became a massive treasure trove for the victors.
Right. What did they actually leave behind?
The Holy League troops captured a staggering amount of material: tens of thousands of tents, thousands of sheep, cattle, and camels, the entire Ottoman artillery train, and Kara Mustafa's massive personal treasury.
All the wealth he was trying to save for himself.
Exactly. The wealth was so immense that King Sobieski, claiming the first pick of the spoils, wrote a letter to Pope Innocent XI.
Yes. Oh, I know this quote. Paraphrasing Julius Caesar, he famously declared, "We came, we saw, God conquered."
That's the one.
So while Sobieski is writing to the Pope and his men are dividing up the Grand Vizier's gold, Kara Mustafa is fleeing south toward Belgrade. And this retreat must have been just an agonizing period of psychological reckoning.
He had a lot to think about.
Because he had spent the entire summer treating Vienna as a simple mathematical problem, like a locked door he could eventually bash open if he applied enough sappers and pressure.
And logistically, he was right. Starhemberg should have surrendered.
Right. The garrison was starving, outnumbered, and the walls were physically breached. But the European defenders had made a completely irrational existential choice.
Kara Mustafa realized, far too late, that he had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the conflict. He viewed it as a border expansion, an imperial acquisition.
But the defenders viewed it as a fight for the survival of their civilization.
Exactly. When a people believe they are facing an existential threat, they stop behaving rationally. They stop measuring the odds. They become immovable.
He spent the whole campaign seeing Vienna as a door. But by the end, he realized he was pushing against a mountain.
He recognized that the Ottoman Empire had struck the absolute limit of its military expansion. You cannot move a people who have collectively decided they would rather be annihilated than submit, no matter how much force you apply.
That bitter clarity must have been terrifying, especially knowing what was waiting for him at the end of the road.
Yeah, by December, Kara Mustafa arrives in Belgrade, and the Sultan's messengers are already there waiting for him.
Because during his disastrous retreat, the political enemies he had left behind in Constantinople saw their opportunity.
They had successfully convinced Sultan Mehmed V that the catastrophe was solely the Grand Vizier's fault, entirely absolving the Sultan of any responsibility for authorizing the campaign in the first place.
Of course, they needed a scapegoat to pacify the outrage of the army and the populace.
So on December 25th, 1683, the messengers present Kara Mustafa with the execution order.
The accounts of his final moments are remarkably stoic, aren't they? For a man whose ambition had just burned the world.
When presented with the Sultan's decree, he understood there was no appeal. His last words were reported to be, "Am I to die?" followed by, "As God pleases."
And then he gave an instruction to the executioners, right?
Yes. As they stepped forward with the silk cord, the man who had commanded 170,000 troops offered one final, precise instruction. Make sure you tie the knot right.
Chilling.
He was strangled. His head was severed, placed in the velvet bag, and carried back to Constantinople to be presented to the Sultan as undeniable proof that the architect of the disaster had been eliminated.
If you step into the shoes of the Sultan for a moment, did Mehmed V think he was just stabilizing his throne? Did he realize that the velvet bag holding Kara Mustafa's head also held the end of the Ottoman Golden Age in Europe?
He probably didn't realize it in the moment, but the historical fallout proved it. The execution fractured the Ottoman leadership completely.
What happened next?
12 different Grand Viziers would cycle through power in the next 2 decades as the empire descended into chaos. The catastrophic loss at Vienna sparked the Great Turkish War.
So Europe went on the offensive.
Yes. The Holy League pressed their advantage. with Charles of Lorraine capturing Buda in 1686 and Belgrade falling in 1688. By 1699, the Treaty of Karlovitz would officially strip the Ottomans of Hungary and Transylvania.
The psychological aura of Ottoman invincibility was permanently broken.
It was. No Ottoman army would ever march on Vienna again.
So briefly recapping this tragedy, Kara Mustafa Pasha was undone by his own ambition, the political viper's nest of his own court, and a fatal, arrogant underestimation of an enemy backed into a corner.
He expected calculation and he met fanatical resolve.
Which leaves us for the final lingering question, a counterfactual to ponder long after this deep dive ends.
What if he had listened?
Exactly. If Kara Mustafa had swallowed his pride, if he had listened to Ibrahim Pasha on the night of September 11th and ordered a strategic withdrawal, he would have saved his army.
But would he have survived the politics of the Ottoman court when he returned empty-handed?
Right. And if that mighty army had somehow survived intact, would the Ottomans have regrouped, returned to Vienna 10 years later with the heavy artillery they needed, and succeeded, completely rewriting the history of the modern world?
Or was the psychological turning point of 1683 just an inevitable fate for an overextended empire?
It's a fascinating thing to think about.
It really is.